Okay, so thought I'd finish up this Unit 9 stuff talking about how those pollutants get there. So we just got through kind of looking at the kind of number one thing that we test for. The first thing we test for typically in waterways is going to be coliforms. Usually if we test for coliforms, those coliforms can kind of be an indicator of what could potentially be happening to cause those things. So if we see large fecal coliform numbers, then that lets us know that there's some sort of issue that is allowing those to get in to the river or aquatic system, as it were. Now, obviously, they're not necessarily bad being there because they can be there in certain limits, but if we're using an area for fish and wildlife habitat and it's too high, then there should be a reason for it that we can address. And so there's some different ways that contaminants can find their ways into ecosystems, and there's some different things that we can do as humans to limit those things. And so really, if we take those two things together, when we test, if we find problems, then we should be able to mediate those problems by doing things that limit those things from happening, right? So really, it's kind of interesting in that humans are part of the problem, but they're also can be part of the solution, which is nice. But the first way that or not the first way, the way that contaminants find their way into these water ecosystems is both naturally and from humans. So typically these limits that we have are okay, and they're kind of the naturally set limits, but sometimes things can happen in nature that can cause those things to get out of balance, and at those times sometimes it's helpful for humans to be there to try to fix that. Then obviously there's ways that humans can be the problem, and typically the two types of pollution we look at are called point source and non-point source pollutions. And in point source pollutions, basically the way I remember it is you can point to the source. So think of Trowbridge's gas company dumping toxic chemicals into the river. That is point source. I can say who did it, when they did it, where they did it, how much they did it, and basically I know. So like you guys may not remember because you're young, but the BP oil spill that happened in the Gulf, that was a point source pollution. We can point to the source where that pollutant is coming from, so that's point source. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the more dangerous one necessarily. The more dangerous one might in fact be non-point source. Non-point source, we can't point to the specific source. So now, if we find oil in the Gulf, for example, we don't know where it is coming from, and we don't see like a leaking well somewhere, then that could be from point source oil pollutants. And what a point source oil pollutant is, or a point source pollutant in general, is where it happens in small amounts over broad areas, and then rain water or runoff picks it up and concentrates it into other areas. So non-point source oil pollution could be that we're parked out in the parking lot and our car has an oil leak. Well, when it rains, where does that oil go? It goes down into the rivers. And if everybody's is now accumulating from, say, the entire Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, and then it flows down the Trinity River towards Houston and then picks up all of Houston's oil debris, and now it dumps it out into the Gulf of Mexico, well, perhaps that non-point source pollution has added up to the point now where it could potentially be worse than say a point source pollution. So neither one of these is worse than the other, but you kind of got to be aware of both, because point source pollution usually involves a fine, government slap on the wrist, those types of things, and then non-point source pollution usually is a little bit more in the gray area. We don't know exactly where it comes from, but there are things we can do to limit it. So we kind of have to treat ourselves as if we were potentially going to do that, and then take steps to hopefully potentially not do that. So if we kind of look at this, keep rolling through this, some natural events that could throw things off kilter. Fires, so if you have a forest fire that wipes out an entire forest, that can lead to sedimentation in the area. It also displaces animals that then might have to use water sources differently. There's a lot of different mechanisms to it providing damage to water quality, but it could potentially happen. Windstorms are another one. Carrying debris can clog up areas or drop off things that weren't typically meant to be there. Disease outbreaks can also happen. These diseases are natural occurring events, and so they can affect our water quality. Watershed, just on this real quick, watershed hydrology is how water flows through the environment, and then water quality is what, how clean is the water. So if we affect hydrology, we can affect quality and vice versa. Volcanoes, floods are other natural events that can cause that, and then climate change is another one that typically can affect our water quality and how it flows through areas. There's some land uses, so these would be kind of the human side. When we change things up for flood control, that can actually cause problems. Timber production can cause problems. Urban development causes problems. Hydroelectric power can cause problems. Agriculture can cause problems. Mining can cause problems. And then this is not on the list. It's kind of under urban development, but just working in your own yard can cause problems. Parking at your own school can cause problems. So how do we mitigate some of these? Well, let's kind of take a look. The way that we try to limit these things is by employing what are called best management practices. And if we put out best management practices, that can help us limit the amount of pollutants that potentially could be put into the system, especially from non-point source point of view. Obviously, point source point of view, we don't really look at best management practices because it's always a best management practice not to dump stuff in the river, right, in large quantities. So really, we're looking at best management practices primarily from a non-point source standpoint, because that's where typically those small things add up. So if we can limit a lot of those small things, then we won't have the addition up to the bigger problems. So let's have a look at some things. First thing I want you to understand is that non-point source pollution is those little things adding up, and there's actually an area in the Gulf of Mexico that they call the dead zone, and it's the area that the Mississippi River empties out into, and so you're pulling all of these areas in the almost 2/3 of the United States is getting funneled into that one area near New Orleans and dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. And what is that land used for? Primarily, it's used for those things that we just went over, human sources, right? Agriculture, urban development, all of that stuff is going on in that region. And one of the biggest ones is agriculture. It is the breadbasket of the world. It's where we grow almost all of the United States crops, and on those crops we put fertilizers, and fertilizers can be pollutants. So the dead zone, let me show you kind of what it looks like. Here's a picture of it. All of this area dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico, and then this is a blown up area of it. And what happens is we get all of these nutrients that we use to grow plants, and if they don't go into the plants, then they run off into the rivers, and if they run off into the rivers, then they get down into the Gulf of Mexico. They essentially become fertilizer for algae, and we get these really large algal blooms. Some of those algal blooms can be things like dinoflagellates, which cause red tides, so that in itself is a toxin, right? But either way, it's going to produce these large, overwhelming populations of phytoplankton, and from what we've seen in population studies, when they have an unlimited source of food, then they're going to explode, but then they're going to get to a spot where they kind of eat themselves out of house and home, and their population will crash. And when their population crashes, now you have a bunch of dead things that need to be recycled, and that's when bacteria comes in and starts to recycle those. But bacteria is going to use oxygen from the water, so it will actually cause hypoxic conditions or low oxygen levels and then any other organism that lives there that breathes oxygen is going to have trouble living there, hence the dead zone. So this actually sets itself up kind of in mid-summer, from mid-June to mid-July, and even past July. But basically it's an area of the Gulf of Mexico that has really low dissolved oxygen rates, and that doesn't mean that everything in there dies, but it just makes it hard to live in there. Now the nice thing is, as you get closer to shore, the effects of this typically are limited, because as you get closer to the shore you get wave action again, and that wave action adds turbulence, which mixes oxygen back into the water. So you don't notice this as much along coastal areas, but when you're out at sea, sometimes researchers especially will notice this, that there's fewer organisms in the area. But notice that on this graphic here, most of that happens and then moves kind of westward towards Texas. That's because there's a counter current on the Gulf here that's actually moving away from Louisiana towards Texas. And basically it's carrying all of that this way. And then notice these hot pockets here. This is where the Trinity River meets the Gulf of Mexico, so that's actually another place that's occurring. And then this is where the, I think that's the Brazos or the Colorado, I can't remember, that's meeting right here in the Gulf. The Trinity River goes through Dallas and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex actually, and through Houston, which are the two largest metropolitan areas in the state, and it dumps all of that out right here. And then the Colorado or Brazos, I can't remember which one this is, but it basically goes through Austin or Waco, and it's also picking up some relatively larger city refuse. So anyway, all of that, this stuff wasn't dumped in the ocean. It's not point source. It's just small amounts of farmland and agriculture and cities using fertilizers that don't get absorbed into the soil and plants, and then they run off, and now they end up down here in the river. That can also be in the form of, one of the main fertilizers is manure. So if you're raising cattle, when that runs off, when their manure runs off into the creeks, that causes problems down the line. So what do we do? Let's kind of look at it. Let's look at each one here, and we'll kind of talk about best management practices as we go. So for agriculture and grazing, feedlots. This is actually a picture of a feedlot up in Greeley, Colorado. It's one of the nation's biggest feedlots. They're basically places where people sell their cattle, and then the company fattens them up. So they feed them, fatten them up, and then they slaughter them. So they spend a few days at these feedlots getting fattened up before they go to slaughter. And these pens are just full. The reason they look dark brown is because they're basically covered with feces. Some of them actually still have animals in them. You can kind of see, but they're covered with feces. So when it rains and there's runoff, you're introducing feces into the river, which is both bacterially not good, and then from a fertilizer standpoint, that manure acts as a fertilizer, so it can create algal blooms, which is kind of what this would look like. Cows, when they get close to rivers, can also destroy riparian zones. We talked about riparian zones being vital to river water quality. If they're trotting through the riparian zone, the next time it rains and the river comes up here, it washes all that away, so that creates cliff banks. It also removes the soil from the area, which is kind of the natural filter that keeps stuff from getting to the river. So by removing all that, then that just increases the problems and compounds the problems, and it basically puts fertilizer into the river, which causes eutrophic levels. Eutrophia, eu means everywhere, troph means energy, so there's energy and food everywhere for these algae to bloom. And then again, when algae bloom, at some point they die. Oxygen is used as bacteria convert them back to recyclable materials through decomposition, so oxygen levels fall, right? And then there's also sedimentation problems. Whenever this sediment runs off, it can actually clog up rivers and lower water quality, right? So what can we do? What are some best management practices? Well, if you fence off your land and keep animals from near the river, then that is going to help maintain your riparian zones. So anything that you can do to maintain more natural riparian zones is going to help. But then beyond that, some of these large feedlot companies actually they try to go in and remove the waste to some degree, and then they sell that waste as a fertilizer or process it into a fertilizer that can then go to plant growing areas. So there are some best management practices there that could be used. And then just about anything you can think of that would help keep these areas from becoming big polluters are kind of the go-to best management practices. Urban development, there's a lot of different things that can happen here. Failing septic systems is a big one on your house. A lot of you live on city grid, which takes your waste to the processing plant, but those people that live outside of the city pipes, essentially their water goes into a septic system that if you improperly maintain can then become problematic because it leaks human waste out into the soil, which then can run off and get into rivers, and that causes some serious problems for us. So you got to take care of your septic systems, and then really that becomes the best management practice for septic systems, is basically making sure that they are running properly and regularly, having them checked out and certified to be in good working order. Septic systems do have to be cleaned every once in a while, so material is removed from them and then taken away. Landfills is another big urban development one. Landfills, typically they used to just dump trash and bury it. Well, all of that waste eventually leaches through the soil and can get into waterways, and that causes all sorts of problems, especially if you have heavy metals being dumped in there and things like that. So nowadays what we have is a picture like this where there is some sort of liner that all the stuff is dumped into. If you go down to the Denton landfill, you can actually see some of these materials being utilized. They actually have a leachate collection system. Basically they're catching that breakdown material, that it becomes like a tea, and they catch that. They can actually process that and use that as a fertilizer, or they can hold it in containment areas. If it is toxic, they can hold it in containment areas to keep it from the environment. But they also typically have methane recovery systems now, which if you look at if you drive down Mayhill and look over at the big fake mountain that is the landfill, you'll see these pipes coming out of the side. Those are methane collection recovery systems, and they actually process that methane gas, and then they use it and convert it to propane, which then they run their city vehicles on. So this is best management practices in the landfill already. And landfills, think about it, if you're carelessly, if you're throwing away your TV, that's heavy metals that could be getting into the landfill. So the landfill tries to sift out some of that stuff, and that's why they say you can't dump that stuff, because they can actually fine you for dumping that stuff. So usually you have to, if you're throwing out a computer, you have to get someone to come and pick it up and recycle it. And if you just throw it in the landfill, then that can cause toxins to get in the landfill that aren't supposed to be there. So there you go. They try not to do that. Then construction sites are another big urban development. Construction sites, they strip away topsoil a lot of times, and when they're in that vulnerable stage, if you get rain or flood events, then things like this can happen, which moves a lot of erosion down stream. So another BMP for that is they actually have these floodgates. If you've ever seen these black paneling that they put around and wondered what those were for, it's for flood control. You'll also see them put like straw in front of gutters, like rain gutters. That's to keep sediment out of the gutter, because if it goes in the gutter, it gets in the river, and once it gets in the river, then that's sedimentation issues, right? So a lot of the BMPs are sometimes it's you can only do certain amounts of work before other amounts are done. So like you can't just come in and strip this off and then wait 5 weeks to come back. You have a timeline to get things done, otherwise you get fined. So that's a big one on construction sites. Logging, is urban development issue. We need wood, right? And so we go and log it, and this is an area that had trees, and now it's been logged, right? And it strips away the trees, which then causes erosion. And this is actually a river delta where eroded soil from these mountains has been carried downstream, and it ends up clogging up the river mouth system. So best management practices, times that you log. So if you have rainy seasons, right, then typically they won't log during those times, because that creates an advantage for runoff to happen. And then replanting efforts is another big one. So a lot of times you'll see logging industries now, they'll come in areas where they are going to log, and they'll actually plant small trees before they do log, so that when the big trees are taken out, the small trees are there to spring up quickly and take their place, hold the soil in place. Air pollution and transportation is another big urban development one. Obviously, people driving around, your cars aren't well maintained, so they're leaking oil, they're putting off exhaust. You know that if you keep them well maintained, then they won't do that. And that would be the best management practice for that in terms of transportation. Obviously, industry has an important part of this. If you've watched some of the Paris Accord agreements about limiting air pollution over the next whatever years, that affects the car industry, that affects the just manufacturing industry. So trying to come up with best management practices that limit those has kind of been on the front burner lately. For you personally, your car, keeping it running, maintained, well maintained, helps. If you are leaking oil, this is one of the things that can happen. The reason I put this picture on here, these oil films, when they get on water, they actually clog the air-water interface. And if that is, oil floats on water, right? So if that is floating on top of water, then air can't get into the water. So you can actually limit the amount of oxygen that can be put back into water environments. So make sure your car is running right. If it's not, get it fixed, right? Let's see, lawn and garden care. That's home. That's you. That's big. Man, if I know it's going to rain like cats and dogs tomorrow, I'm not putting out my fertilizer today. One, you're wasting your fertilizer, but more importantly, your fertilizer gets washed off your yard, goes down the drain, and now it becomes fertilizer for phytoplankton in the river or lake that it goes to, and that causes the algal blooms, which can then limit the amount of oxygen, which can then kill fish. So what you do in your yard is important, especially for us, to the Lake Louisville watershed. Most of what you do here goes into Lake Louisville, so limiting when you put down fertilizer is a good idea. The other thing is pesticides. Pesticides usually kill hard-shelled critters that live in your lawn. If those get washed into the creek, that kills hard-shelled critters in the creek, which means that it's killing a lot of your microorganisms, macroorganisms, Daphnia, like we've seen before, crawfish, things like that would be killed by pesticides pretty easily. And if those things die, then that's a food source for fish that's gone, right? Some of those pesticides are toxic enough that they'll kill fish. There's some pesticides that will alter the DNA of fish. So you got to be careful with what you're putting on your yard, and more importantly, when you're putting it on your yard. By dumping those chemicals on your yard before rainstorms, that has a chance to wash them away. If you slowly water those things into your yard over time, then that's better. While we're on that note, I don't have this anywhere, but kitchen grease. Let's talk kitchen grease. If you use vegetable oil to cook a bunch of stuff, if you just dump that, a lot of people dump that in the trash, that goes to the landfill. That can be bad in the landfill. If you just dump it in your backyard somewhere, that can get into the waterways. So what should you do with it? How should you dispose of it? If you use a grill, or if you use any kind of fire starting mechanism, don't do this in your house, but just a little bit of that oil on some newspaper will help start your charcoal grill, would help start your fire pit fire, rather than using like these toxic starter logs and things like that. Really just a paper towel with a little bit of vegetable oil, used vegetable oil on it, will actually burn like a candle, and it's a good fire starter for your grills and stuff. Plus, it's just cooking grease. Once it cooks off, there's no toxins left. It's better than fire starter. This is just a graphic of showing how direct discharges, so point source pollution and that kind of stuff, can cause water quality problems. Anytime we dump something straight into water, typically it's going to affect the chemistry of the water, and ultimately the more it's usually affects oxygen, and if we affect oxygen, then that affects wildlife in there. So the best management practices were things that we could use to limit those pollutions in our waterways. I think that's everything. Let me just kind of walk through this. Oh, I wanted to talk about, because really point source discharges are, they happen. But I wanted to tell you one about that happened in Dallas, Texas at one time. And this is a point source discharge. And you might think that this one's interesting because what's being discharged is, one, unintentional, and then two, you wouldn't think that it would be necessarily a pollutant. So let's take a look at it. So this is actually a packing plant down in Dallas, Texas, that it's no longer open, and it's because this spill happened. And so here's how it happened. Someone was just looking through the satellite images and saw this on there and got curious. So if you notice right up here at the top, there's like this dark colored water coming in, and we'll kind of work to that here in a minute, but there's a creek that runs through here, right, and the packing plant is right here. So let's zoom in. Stream flow is this way. There's a sewer line out here that's here, and you can see that the area around the sewer line looks weird, right? And then the creek color, if you look at it right here, is kind of a greenish color, right? And this is shadow from the trees, so that's not like dark colored, but it's kind of a greenish color. But then over here, it's kind of a brownish red color, right? And that's just in line with where this sewer line is, right? So someone was looking at and wondering what's going on, and then this is where that river empties into the Trinity River, and you can really tell that that's like dark stained water coming in. So what's going on? Well, the old packing plant packages pork and pork-related products. So they actually get slaughtered pigs in their facility, and so what you're seeing there is actually blood that's entered the waterway. And you might be thinking, well, blood, how's blood really a pollutant? It should break down within the environment, and it does, but when it's in this concentration, what is blood designed to do? It goes to your lungs and gets oxygen from the air and releases carbon dioxide back out, right? So blood likes to grab oxygen. So if there's blood in the water, it's trying to grab oxygen out of the water, so that's bad, right? Then not only that, it is proteins and cells that have to decompose because they're now not where they can live, right? And so they're gonna die, and now bacteria comes in and decomposes them, and we talked about earlier that decomposition process uses oxygen, so now we're using oxygen in that area. And so the blood pulls in oxygen, and then the bacteria use more oxygen to get rid of the blood. So we're basically creating these anoxic conditions, and there's actually going to be fish kills here because of that. Now, what happens is that is a point source discharge. Can we figure out exactly where it came from? Yes, you Columbia packing plant are at fault, which sometimes is not so cut and dry, because Columbia packing plant tried to say, well, city of Dallas, this is your sewer line that's broken. City of Dallas is saying, no, you shouldn't be dumping blood down the sewage system anyway. So you can have the litigation, and the litigation for this, I think, is still ongoing. I don't know if there's ever been a resolution to it, but I know the Columbia packing plant was ordered to halt production while they were figuring all this out, and I think they haven't reopened since, but feel free to look it up. But that would be an example of your point source discharges and how they can get into the waterways and cause problems. So I'm done there. I think Unit 9's done. We'll tag a quiz on this, and then we'll put this one in the books and be done with this unit. So if you have any questions, get back to me, and we'll figure them out.